Hello there, it's Andy Parks from the Washington Times, and I'll be joined by Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor Stephen Dinan right after this. But you know, as a listener to my podcast, you qualify to receive a 50% discount on an annual digital subscription to the Washington Times. Simply go to washingtontimes.com/Andy. That's washingtontimes.com/ANDY. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here he is, Assistant Managing Editor of the Washington Times, Stephen Dinan. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Andy.
Supreme Court test Roe. Conservative judges mull scrapping viability standard for abortion bans. Sounds like the court would be okay with a few bends, but not necessarily a few breaks.
Definitely seem to show an interest by the GOP, the 6 GOP appointed justices, to do something other than the current Roe v. Wade / Casey standard. Roe v. Wade being the 1973 decision that established a national constitutional right to abortion, wiping away restrictions in a number of the states, imposing a national standard. Casey being the 1992 decision, the last time the court really sort of grappled with the fundamentals of Roe, and conservatives at that time had anticipated that Roe would be overturned based on the GOP appointed justices. Instead, Casey reaffirmed most of Roe with a new viability standard. Under Roe, it was, hey, abortions in the first 2 trimesters, states could restrict in the third. Casey substituted something called the viability standard, that abortion pre-viability, that states could impose bans post-viability of a fetus. Now the justices were presented with a Mississippi law that bans most abortions after 15 weeks. And the justices were sort of saying, why is the viability standard so much more important, so much better than this 15-week? Some of the justices were looking to go further, or at least pondering going further. Justice Kavanaugh, a Trump appointee to the court, repeatedly asked all of 3 lawyers who were arguing the case, asked them all, hey, the Constitution doesn't say abortion. Isn't this exactly the sort of issue that we should not put our finger on as the court? We shouldn't be a pro-choice court. We shouldn't be a pro-life court. Why don't we leave that to the states and to the political branches, Congress? He tested all of the lawyers over that. He was sort of the most forthright in grappling with doing away with Roe altogether and returning the issue back to the states where it was pre-1973. Chief Justice Roberts, on the other hand, was sort of adamant in saying, what's wrong with 15 weeks? What's wrong with what Mississippi did? Perhaps the most important thing out of this is the willingness, it appeared to be the willingness of the GOP appointed justices not to let Roe stand as is untouched. There's all sorts of talk about Roe as a super precedent, that overturning it would ruin the court and cleave the social fabric of America. And the GOP appointed justices had all sorts of reasons, and some very compelling reasons, why allowing a badly written and many people argue wrongly decided Roe to remain the law of the land just because it's been around for 50 years.
All right, so what's next?
Well, so we're likely to get a decision. It's not a guarantee, but likely to get a decision by the end of this term, next late June of 2022. But even before that, there's still another case that the justices heard on Texas's new abortion law. This was heard a couple of weeks ago, where Texas has this law that allows that bans abortions and allows private citizens, basically turns enforcement over to private citizens. That law, that ruling may come even before the Mississippi case ruling. So there are 2 big cases, really severe challenges to Roe pending before the court. And to be seen, this is very dangerous to guess, but if I were guessing right now based on the oral argument, which as I said is always very risky, but I would guess that Chief Justice Roberts is going to try to craft together some sort of court majority that doesn't overturn all of Roe, but does seek to carve out a different standard than the viability standard that's been sort of the law for the last 30 years. And the question is whether he can get enough other justices to make that the central ruling. I suspect there are probably 3 or 4 justices who'd be willing to overturn Roe altogether. They can get a 5th, then Roberts probably loses that bid to craft a new standard that doesn't challenge all of Roe. But if Roberts can't get somebody else on board, then there may be a ruling that overturns Roe.
Okay, now I'm going to take it to another story. New York Attorney General says states should become abortion sanctuary. This is Attorney General Letitia James of New York. It sounds as if she's volunteered the state and wants to fund it to some degree, just in case the court overturns Roe v. Wade.
Exactly.
A bit presumptuous on her behalf, isn't it?
Well, yes, until you realize that she's also running for governor, and
Oh,
this is very much a bid to try and lock down the liberal wing of the New York Democratic primary, as we saw in the presidential primaries last year. Abortion right, a very important issue for Democratic voters, and in particular Democratic primary voters. And the further left you can go on the issue, generally the better off you are in a Democratic primary, which is why you saw in the presidential primary last year, you saw Joe Biden, who has voted for 40 years and voted for bills that preserved the ban on taxpayer funding for abortions. You saw Joe Biden, basically switch that position and embrace, and now as president, try and carry out a policy of having federal taxpayer money go to elective abortions. That leftward drift is the key on this. But, as you said, this is a really stunning proposal. She wants New York to spend its taxpayer money to pay for women in, say, in Mississippi or another state, Texas, to be able to travel, stay, and obtain an abortion procedure. We're talking potentially thousands of dollars per person. She wants New York to become a sanctuary, safe haven for women in other states to come to get abortion. It's a fascinating proposal. You wonder how much the state really would want to commit financially to that, given other budget challenges. So in some ways, I sort of take it as more of a symbolic proposal than something where the state is actually going to fund it. But it does raise all those issues of what the role is for one state versus another state, and trying to thwart what's going on in other states. If you really can just escape across state lines, which of course is true for many things, but if you can just go across state lines to get the procedure, well, doesn't that make this a right for the wealthy? And her goal is eradicate that and make sure that poor women in those other states won't have to pay to be able to go across state lines. So all sorts of, I really quickly back to the fundamental case itself. Two things stood out in the oral argument. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, an Obama appointee to the bench, made the point that if we start overturning Roe, a decision big, as sort of crucial as the Second Amendment rights, the 2008 Heller decision that found a personal Second Amendment right to own and bear arms, it could be the next to go, sort of warning conservatives, hey, be careful what precedents you guys go after. On the other hand, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a Trump appointee, the most recent addition to the court, raised a very fascinating juxtaposition. She said, the abortion rights advocates were arguing that a woman's bodily autonomy is at stake here, and that's sort of the crux of abortion rights. And she said, argument sounds awfully similar to what we're arguing about right now with vaccine mandates. So all sides might want to try and be consistent in how they see bodily autonomy for vaccines versus abortion. So it's just some fascinating repercussions possible with whatever the court does.
all right. I was talking with Charlie Hurt just a little while ago about his column that deals in part with the travel ban, and I mentioned your story. Biden's new COVID-19 travel ban ignores southern border. You mean there's a gaping hole in the ban? If you somehow get to Mexico, you're in?
If you get to Mexico and walk across the border, if you're from South Africa and you get to Mexico, and you, in particular, if you are a child or if you're an adult who brings a child, the U.S. government, under the sort of current catch and release posture, is not likely to return you back to Mexico. It's not likely to expel you. You're probably going to be processed and released into the U.S. So, and that's the former commissioner of Customs and Border Protection under the Trump administration who's making this point. He says, look, the southern border was a glaring hole throughout the last 9 months, nine or 10 months of the Biden administration, as they continued the Trump travel ban, broad travel restrictions for coronavirus, but they relaxed border enforcement. Suddenly, people from 160 countries were arrested jumping the southern border because they thought, hey, this is a way we can get in and gain a foothold. Almost certainly some of those are people who might have tried to come legally, but for COVID travel restrictions, and figured we can get in through the southern border. With the current travel ban, we're not talking about a lot of numbers. There are only, I think, 8 people from South Africa caught at the border in fiscal year 2020. Obviously that was the overall flow was less, but Omicron virus spreads, and the administration ponders next steps. It really does tell you, hey, The southern border has been for the last 9 months and remains a weird loophole in our efforts to control the introduction and spread of new cases of this.
All right, before I let you run, anything you're working on we should know about?
Yeah, it's a complicated story, but sort of an important story. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas in late September announced new rules restricting how his agents and officers are allowed to arrest illegal immigrants, a list of priorities for enforcement. This Homeland Security Secretary declared that merely being in the country illegally is no longer a reason to be deported. There must be something beyond just being in violation of the law for them to actually exercise the consequences of the law. Really stunning statement. This is almost certain to be legally challenged, and in fact, this is already wrapped up in a couple of ongoing cases. We've done some research and found there's something called the Administrative Procedures Act that governs how the government makes policies, and it requires them not to make arbitrary and capricious decisions. In making this decision, the administration in Mayorkas released a bunch of documents trying to justify all the steps he took to make sure that his decision wasn't arbitrary and capricious, laying out people that he said he met with and concerns that he took into account as he decided his policy. We went ahead and talked with several of the groups, in particular the pro-enforcement groups that he said he met with. He didn't meet with many, but the ones that he said he met with. And interestingly enough, they're like, we didn't. I mean, they say that they may have had meetings, but they never talked about these priorities. And so it's a real issue. It really undercuts the record that they tried to build for good decision making. If they're embellishing the meetings that they said the secretary had in order to make this decision, well, when judges look at this, they may say, hey, if you're lying about that, then this is an arbitrary and capricious decision. So a real challenge for the administration to defend Mayorkas's decision making on those new enforcement rules.
Look forward to reading more about that. Thank you, Stephen. As always, we'll do it again next week.
My pleasure, Andy.
Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, Stephen Dinan. Thanks for joining me today, and remember to receive a 50% discount on an annual digital subscription to the Washington Times. Go to washingtontimes.com/Andy. You'll get 24/7 digital access to the Washington Times at 50% off. Again, go to washingtontimes.com/ANDY. I'm Andy Parks. Have a great day.